This talk is not about the Grand Lodge of China, and though it may seem to be about Chinese history, it may also have a bearing on Freemasonry. As I have written in my two books on Freemasonry, Initiation by Light and Freemasonry Royal Arch, I believe that speculative Freemasonry was constructed in 1717 around a Chinese theme, that of Taoism. There have been three golden ages in Chinese history. The Zhou Dynasty from about 1046 BC to 256 BC, the Han Dynasty from 202 BC to 220 AD, and the Ming Dynasty from 1368 to 1644. And of these, the longest was the Zhou Dynasty, lasting 790 years. Compare this to England, where the longest royal house was that of the Tudors, spanning 387 years, just half as long as the Zhou. When the Romans invaded England in 43 AD, the country was still struggling with tribal conflicts, whereas 1,000 years before this date, the Zhou had already established kingdoms and bureaucracies. Initiation by Light, I give an abbreviated history of China, but the Zhou Dynasty started before even these imperial dynasties. During the Zhou Dynasty, the running of the government was left up to the three most senior officials, called the Three Excellencies. In its 790-year history, Zhou had 37 kings. At this time, there was no emperor until the first emperor in 221 BC, who was able to unify all the independent kingdoms to form the Empire of China. This image is of King Zhao of Zhou, one of the first kings of Zhou. His unique hat with tassels in the front was a crown that Mian Guang, so that the common people could not see his face, as he was thought to be semi-divine. The kings of Zhou left the day-to-day running of government to these three officials, who were also dukes, and they helped administer the kingdom as regents, especially if the kings were very young. The Zhou Dynasty was famous for, among other things, classifying the population into four occupations. First, the shi, the gentry, scholars, and warriors at the top. Then nog, the farmers and peasants. Next, gong, the artisans and craftsmen. And finally, shang, the merchants and traders. This is a very Taoist way of thinking, because scholars were thought to be more important than merchants who only grubbed for money all the time. Also, farmers had a high status as they created the food that supported the economy. A second important fact about the Zhou was that both famous philosophers, Lao Tzu and Confucius, were born in this era. Lastly, and this may tie in with the theme of my book, Freemasonry Initiation by Light, the concept of the mandate of heaven was created in the Zhou Dynasty, which may have had a strong effect on King James in England. Like the Han Dynasty, the Zhou Dynasty in later times was remembered in idealistic terms, so much so that when the Ming Dynasty fell in 1644 and the turncoat, General Wu Sangui, and declared himself the Emperor of China, he called his spurious dynasty the Great Zhou Dynasty. The top three Zhou officials, called the Three Excellencies, were the Grand Tutor, Tai Bo, and the Grand Protector, Tai Bao, and the Grand Master, Tai Shi. In Chinese, Tai in the title means senior or highest, and not thick and fat as used in Japanese. The title Grand Master, as used in ancient China and Freemasonry, may have been just a coincidence, because later, during the fall of the Ming Dynasty, when the Tiandehui resistant groups were set up, creating lodges of 3 officers with ceremonies and passwords similar to Freemasonry, the title of Grand Master was not reintroduced. Secondly, not all scholars agree on the English translations of many of the Chinese official ranks, and there are several interpretations. And later, the Grand Master was also called the Grand Preceptor and then the Grand Chamberlain. In England, there have been several organizations using the title Grand Master, with the earliest being the Templars from 1100 AD to 1314, with the last being Grand Master Jacques de Molay. Among operative Masons, there have been several examples of the title Grand Master. Inigo Jones was called a Grand Master in a spurious document dated 1603. And construction on a new St. Paul's Cathedral, which started in 1675, showed that the cornerstone was laid by Thomas Strong, who is said to have been an operative Grand Master. Finally, George Oliver also states that Sir Christopher Wren was a Grand Master in 1685, which is also repeated in the constitutions of Freemasons of 1723. Whether these Grand Masters really were Grand Masters, or this is just a title that was attributed at a later date, it is hard to know. Again, it is difficult to know how speculative Freemasonry was rebuilt in the early years, as no documentation survives. As I believe that speculative Freemasonry was constructed on a skeleton of operative Masonry, adding Chinese Taoist lessons, it is quite possible that the new Freemasons chose the title of Grand Master for their organization based on the history of the Zhou Dynasty, as it was appropriate to the Chinese theme of their new organization. It is interesting that in the ancient Zhou Dynasty, the king was supported by the Three Excellencies, one of whom was the Grand Master. And in a similar way, in England, in 1820, George, the Prince of Wales, became king, and his younger brother, the Duke of Sussex, was elevated to Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, also supported by his 2 wardens. Thank you.